quarter of a mile, slide right onto causeway, A312. Take the next right onto causeway, A312. Continue on A312 for 1 mile. In 300 yards, at Wagoners Roundabout, take the second exit onto the Parkway, A312. Exit the roundabout onto the Parkway. Continue on the Parkway for 1 mile. In 300 yards, at Cranford Parkway interchange, take the second exit onto the M4 slip road to Heathrow Airport, M25.
There's going to be hopefully a few surprises as well.
That's really interesting, Fabrice. Can I ask you one final thing? You've been sitting in the middle of NATO looking at situations before. It's been said by somebody else that this is the nearest we have come to nuclear war since 1962. Do you agree with that?
It's the nearest we have come to not having a grip on the nuclear escalation, absolutely. And I think it falls again on NATO's leadership to regain some control and make very clear that weapons of mass destruction, being nuclear or chemical, have no place in that conflict. And if they were to be used, the consequences will be devastating.
Exit the roundabout onto the slip road.
For NATO to actually,
in a quarter of a mile, merge onto
in
M4.
order to avoid that nuclear escalation.
Fabrice Gauthier, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. I can hardly believe we're having this conversation, but you are very lucid. Thanks so much. Ben Kentish, after that extraordinary comment made by Sajid Javid this morning, what's the number 10 reaction? I mean, I know you're in and out all the time. Are they responding any further to this?
They want to make very clear, Andrew, that any sort of attack, any sort of threat to NATO would trigger a much more significant response from the Western NATO.
So does that suggest in a way that they agree with Fabrice that there should be a louder NATO response than there has been so far?
I think, no, not necessarily. I think they are very, very aware of NATO and the West's need to not escalate this any further. So, for example, there's been a pretty united response from the UK, the US, most of NATO to Volodymyr Zelensky's request for a no-fly zone. Even the request that jets be supplied to Ukraine so that they could effectively enforce their own no-fly zone. Both of those requests were rejected.
But doesn't that mean, I'm sorry to keep breaking, doesn't that mean that, as Bruce was saying, that Russia is in charge of the pace of escalation? They seem in some respects still to be in control of this.
Yes, I think there is a sense that effectively what happens will depend on how far Vladimir Putin goes, not so much NATO. There's a bigger concern, I think, Andrew, in Whitehall. The bigger concern is not that Putin somehow attacks NATO, it's that the more he is boxed into a corner, by which I mean the more that things don't go to plan as Russia sees it in Ukraine, the more desperate, the more extreme, potentially the more irrational he will get. So the bigger concern isn't that he will somehow attack Poland or another NATO state, it's that he may use what's called non-conventional weapons, chemical, biological, nuclear, within Ukraine. And that would pose a huge question for NATO, because under the terms of their charter, they would not be obliged in any way to respond to that, but there would clearly be huge pressure for them to do so.
I was going to say, from what you can pick up, is there any indication that anyone in the West has any kind of potential response to that? A battlefield nuclear weapon, God forbid, goes off in Ukraine, or indeed there's the use of gas or biological weapons, clouds start to blow around. Is there really any sense of how NATO would respond?
There's huge uncertainty. I think the most illuminating example is Joe Biden, in a sense, who continually emphasises the desire not to effectively trigger World War III. Now that's raised concerns amongst some sort of hawks, Andrew, because they say, well, actually, does that mean that if Vladimir Putin did do something like that in Ukraine, that the US would say, well, we've got to respond, but ultimately would stop short of responding in a sort of proportionate way, because the overriding concern is not to escalate. The big unknown is, if it's Russia that escalates this conflict, will NATO respond proportionally, or will it say, actually, to Ukraine, I'm really sorry, you're not a NATO state, we will not trigger World War III over this, regardless of what the Kremlin does.
The familiar, if not always reassuring tones of Ben Kentish, LBC's Westminster correspondent. Thanks very much indeed for that. Now then, coming up, Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, will be joining me in the studio. You're listening to Andrew Marr, and Amelia Cox as your news.
Anyone in the UK who wants to sponsor a Ukrainian refugee can now apply online. The Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove has told MPs the first hosts will be matched with people fleeing the conflict this week. David Davis has told LBC the government should introduce laws to seize the assets of oligarchs in the UK. Speaking on Tonight with Andrew Marr, the former Brexit secretary says he believes ministers are scared of being sued. The government has suggested it's considering whether to house refugees in properties belonging to sanctioned oligarchs. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has been denied permission to appeal a decision to extradite him to the US. The Supreme Court has rejected his attempt.
In a quarter of a mile, keep right to stay on M4.
Last year.
LBC Business Update.
With Direct Line Business Insurance, go direct and see if you could get a better deal.
The shift to working from home during the COVID pandemic has seen major changes in the baskets of goods used to calculate inflation. Men's suits and donuts are out.
Keep right to stay on M4.
As lockdown led to an increase in pet ownership. LBC weather, clear spells tonight for many, rain in the far north and west by dawn, a low of freezing.
LBC. You love Zoom for video meetings? Now, choose Zoom to power your phone communications too. Zoom Phone works seamlessly within the Zoom app as your business phone system. Zoom Phone's secure HD audio and enterprise-grade reliability keep you connected to your teams and your customers. And it's easy to use on mobile, desktop, or desk phone. Empower your workforce with Zoom Phone. Zoom. How the world connects.
As millions held their breath, humanity takes its first steps on the moon.
In your lifetime, you've witnessed science fiction become reality. It's now possible for everyone to have the internet in their pocket.
Surgeons have successfully transplanted a human heart.
But when it comes to heart disease, at the British Heart Foundation, we're just getting started. More than half our funding comes from gifts and wills. You can use the power of yours to help us fund life-saving breakthroughs, to leave a lasting legacy and turn science fiction into reality again.
It's 2024 and the British Heart Foundation has today announced the Heart of the Future.
Search BHF Willpower to get a free gifts and wills guide and see how you can get a solicitor's help in writing or updating your will for free.
This is the new way to sell your car from home. This is the...
There's an object on road ahead.
Trusted dealers compete to give you the best price, meaning you could get more than you expected for your old car. And once you've found the perfect price, you can sit back and relax. We'll pick your car up from home for free. It really is that simple. Get your quote and get started at motorway.co.uk. This is the way. This is the motorway.
This is LBC Tonight with Andrew Marr.
The time is nearly 6:34. If you are unlucky enough...
In a quarter of a mile, keep right to stay on M4.
The police arriving very fast or in great numbers. But when a Russian oligarch's mansion was taken over today by protesters wanting to hand it to Ukrainian refugees, the police piled in mob-handed. Helmets, riot shields, a traffic jam of vans, you name it. Utterly absurd.
Keep right to stay on M4.
Mayor of London is on. Well, let's find out because Sadiq Khan is with me now. Sadiq Khan, whose side were you on in that?
Well, I'm coming to...
Continue on M4 for 4 miles.
Been busy doing other things. Operational issues are clearly a matter for the police. I was surprised that, look, I mean, we know that there are many properties in London owned by Russian oligarchs close to Putin. One of my concerns is we've had a number of weeks now to seize those homes to allow them to be used by refugees. They haven't. And I don't condone the actions of the squatters, but they've decided to take the law into their own hands.
They were actually doing what I think an awful lot of people think should be done. In other words, they were taking over this empty mansion owned by a chap who's been a friend of Labour and of Tory politicians, but is now persona non grata. And people will it's the priorities of the police, I guess, that people find very, very odd. Because quite seriously, a lot of London's families, if they're burgled, you phone up the police don't turn up. But for this, scores and scores and scores of police. It doesn't seem right.
I've not spoken to the Commissioner about this today, but it does raise questions. I completely understand that. I'm unclear what the police were responding to, because we know there was living there. I'm not sure if there were concerns about any crimes being committed to the neighbouring properties. So those are the sort of questions
All they were doing was hanging a few flags and banners over a balcony or two, as far as I could see.
I bet they went.
Well,
if there was a bar.
For me, the more important, aside from the actions of people who may have broken the law and whether the response from the police was proportionate, is this is one of many homes, properties in London sitting empty, as this one has been for some time, gathering dust. We know owned by Russian oligarchs close to Putin, and there's no reason at all why those properties couldn't have been seized earlier to allow them to be used, whether it's for those fleeing Ukraine or even sold and the money's used for worthy causes, rather than being sitting empty and people taking the law into their own hands.
So you have some sympathy for what they were doing. Right earlier in the week you said that you had a great deal of sympathy for anyone in London who was going to open their homes to refugees. Well, here is a home being opened, admittedly not their home, but nonetheless a home is being opened. Some sympathy for them.
Well, that's my point. This is one of many properties in London that are sitting empty. As Amanda said, they're quite large properties which could home a number of families. One of my concerns has been when I first ran for mayor in 2016, I was talking about London being seen around the world as the money laundering capital of the world. At the very least, we should have...
In 2 miles, at junction 6, take the A355 exit to Slough Central.
Owned by overseas company, whether they're shell companies registered in tax haven or owned by those from overseas, not because I'm against foreigners. So we could then see whether they're using our homes as money laundering vehicles. And also, what Londoners find unacceptable is when we have a housing crisis, all these homes sitting empty for year on year.
Why do you think it is, though, that these people in an oligarch's mansion got more of a police response by occupying it than they would have done had they burgled it?
Well, like I said, I don't know the facts, and what I don't want to do is criticise an operational matter about which I don't know the facts. But I do understand.
You will be talking to the Commissioner about this.
I of course understand that the concerns not just raised by you, but raised by your listeners about the issue of whether this is a proportionate response, about the issue of what are the priorities in relation to responses to issues raised by members of the public. That's right. I'm not.
And you will talk to the Commissioner about it.
Or number two, but somebody in the Met Police Service. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Now let's ask about your initiative today on violence against women and girls, because posters are going to be put up in football clubs and many other places. And again, I have to ask, are posters going to go up inside the offices and the canteens of the Metropolitan Police, given what we've seen over the last couple of years?
Let me explain the context. The context is, in my view, we have an epidemic of male violence against women and girls. Sarah Everard was abducted and murdered just over a year ago. Since she was abducted, there have been 127 women killed by men across the country. That's one every 3 days. In my view, misogyny is linked to violence. Why do I say that? Because I've seen how sexism, inappropriate attitudes, at least inappropriate behaviour, what we as men think is banter or fun, is not received that way often by women. There's an amazing stat, Andrew.
There needs to be a change in culture.
There's a stat that Amanda may find
in a quarter of a mile, at junction 6, take the A355 exit to Slough Central.
Public place. When you look at those aged between 18 and 24, it's 86%.
Yeah, that is an appalling figure.
What we're doing now, Andrew, what we're doing is targeting men and boys, because I think we've got to reflect on our own behaviour and challenge those of our mates and others as well.
I think it's really commendable what you're doing, and even when they get to my age, you still get those.
Exit at junction 6.
It's not just young women, but it's particularly traumatic for them. But what also concerns me as a Londoner is that
in a quarter of a mile, at the roundabout, take the 3rd exit onto Tuns Lane, A355.
3 days, a young man is killed on London streets, and we've got the highest record now, 22 deaths. It just seems that we're not having huge poster campaigns for.
Let me deal with that. So you're right. The number of violent crime caused by knives is far too high. We have a public health approach in London, Amanda, which has led to violent crime going down.
But not this. This has gone up.
Let me respond to this. The number of knife crime going down, the number of knife crime injuries going down. But you're right, the number of homicides, even though there are a few people being stabbed, homicides has gone up. You're spot on. So what we're doing is making sure that we, at an earlier stage, prevent a young person picking up a knife in the first place. When I speak to trauma experts at A&Es, they're saying the frenzied attack is now more common than it was years ago.
So
our approach is...
Sorry, can I just break in on this? Because can I ask you about, it seems to me there is a widespread hypocrisy on this issue. The truth is that most of these attacks, and woundings and indeed murder.
Exit the roundabout onto Tons Lane.
Attacks. And frankly, it seems to a lot of people that the rest of London doesn't really care that much. And
In a quarter of a mile, turn left towards Sippenham Lane.
allowed to cope with a level of violence the rest of us would not tolerate for a day. And this goes on and on and on. And I know there have been lots of initiatives, but the attacks go on. And there is nothing like enough money and impact being done at a local level for these kids. There should be far more being done really in small groups. I know there are groups in Camden, in other words, doing some fantastic groups work on the streets, but there's not nearly enough being done. And on your watch, as with your predecessors, this mayhem has just been allowed to continue.
Let me respond. The scheme in Camden is funded by us, by the way, and that's using a public health approach to deal with violent crime. What I mean by that, you treat crime.
Turn left towards Sippenham Lane.
Treat the infection, stop it spreading, but stop it occurring in the first place. So we're investing in young people, what Tony Blair would call being tough on the causes of crime.
Continue for 1.5 miles.
You can't escape the fact, Andrew, for the last 12 years, cuts in funding have meant youth clubs closed down, after-school clubs closed down, summer holiday schemes closed down. So not surprisingly, I'm not excusing criminality, you have young people hanging around street corners getting involved in criminality.
But do you not have the budget, do you not have the money to help with
Let me
this?
explain. That's the point I was saying in response to Amanda's previous question, which is the number of teenage homicides is unacceptably high. I accept that completely. I meet bereaved families both when I was a member of Parliament and as the mayor, and it's heartbreaking. We are making progress though in relation to reducing all levels of violent crime. In the last 6 months, the number of teenage homicides, thankfully, is going down in huge numbers, still too high. But that means, Andrew, both investing in the police, we have now 1,300 more officers because of our investment from City Hall, but also giving young people constructive things to do. And the two basic things we're doing, which is really important in this area, is one, every young Londoner will have access to a mentor, and every young Londoner will have access to youth facilities. Important to give them constructive things to do so their potential is fulfilled rather than the life cut short.
You have introduced new cycleways all around London. As somebody who can't cycle for disability reasons, I'm finding it increasingly hard to get around this capital city. It seems to me that large parts of London have become effectively a car park, and that you have allowed roadworks to happen simultaneously all across bits of London, so they're completely closed to ordinary traffic. I've looked at the numbers, and the average traffic speed in London in 2010 was 17 miles an hour, which is not fast, and now it's 9 miles an hour. Are you trying to drive car drivers out of London?
Well, I don't recognise those stats, but no. So let me deal with the number of points you've raised.
TfL travel report.
Let me deal with the number of stats you've raised in relation to that. So we've seen post-pandemic a massive return to people driving their cars rather than using public transport, for reasons we understand, because they're concerned about social distance and the virus. And so we've got to give people an alternative to driving their car, which means increasing the number of safe cycling, widening pavements.
It's all very well if you can cycle.
Well, the number of people who lose their lives on our roads is more. I'm not equivocating people losing their lives by knife or by road traffic accidents is more, and the serious injuries is more than
I'm just saying, if you can't cycle, it's really hard to get around London.
But also, the number of premature deaths caused by air pollution is more than 4,000 a year. I do not want London to be gridlocked. What I want London to do is what I want London roads to do is be freed up for those who need to be using the roads, those in taxis, those who can't cycle, plumbers, electricians. Because more and more people are driving their cars, it means our roads are gridlocked. We're a Roman village that's spread over 1,000 years.
Bit by bit, you're trying to get ordinary car users out of London, and it seems to a lot of people there is, as it were, a kind of underlying secretive plan to get cars out of London.
There's nothing secret about my plan.
It's real.
I still got a manifesto to be the most green mayor London's ever had, and I secured more votes than any sitting mayor. I do want to encourage more people to cycle. I do want to encourage more people to walk, and more people to use public transport. I do want to also encourage those who don't need to drive to not be driving, so people like you can be freed up to get around in a vehicle.
Let's go back to the bigger story of the day, which is the refugee announcement from the government. Do you by and large think they've got it right when it comes to this way of allowing people to get refugees into their homes and paying £350 a month for families prepared to have Ukrainian refugees to live with them? By and large, thumbs up or a thumbs down?
By and large, progress has now been made now that Michael Gove's taken charge of this. The last 3 weeks has been woefully inadequate. I feel embarrassed when I speak to German friends and French friends and Spanish friends and Italian friends when I compare and contrast the generosity of Londoners versus what we've been able to deliver It's largely the responsibility of the government. I think it's important for two things to happen. One is for the scheme by which those from Ukraine come here be far simpler. And secondly, for there to be public support, public government support for not just the members of the public, but also for councils. They'll need these people who come will need help with those who are traumatised, those who need English as a second language, making sure there are places in schools. We've got hotels queuing up to help, councils queuing up to help, Londoners queuing up to help, but we need support from the government.
Do you think it should be visa free?
No, I don't.
You don't?
I think there are some countries that have got no visas. I think it's possible though to make it far quicker and far simpler, rather than the current scheme.